Welcome to the Everyday Spirituality Podcast. I'm James Hazelwood, author, bishop, and spiritual companion, bringing you interviews and information at the intersection of a gritty Christian mysticism and depth psychology. You can find all the episode show notes, as well as my free Substack newsletter, Notebooks, at jameshazelwood.net. Now, on to the show. Welcome to the late September 2023 episode of the Everyday Spirituality Podcast. This episode is a wonderful conversation with Dale Allison, who is a New Testament professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. But no, we're not going to talk about the Gospel of John. Instead, we're going to discuss his new book, Encountering Mystery: Religious Experience in a Secular Age. This theme of a religious experience in a secular age comes up again and again. In the future, we'll have a conversation with David Tacey, who's written a book about the same topic, but from a different angle. It's fascinating that the more secular we get, the greater our hunger for spiritual encounter. The book of Dale's is quite fascinating. It's particularly helpful for many of us who kind of live in the quasi-church field, mainline Protestant, used to be church, but have an interest, but, kind of have a rational, intellectual approach to it. Why it's so fascinating, what Dale does is he goes and talks with people about religious experiences they have had, whether they are angels, mysterious encounters in nature, conversations with people who have passed away, and he puts them all together in these different categories and helps us look at them in a way that's really helpful. And then concludes basically also with, how do we deal with this question of these seemingly irrational experiences from a rational point of view? So I think you'll enjoy this conversation. The book, I highly recommend it. It's really helpful. There's links in the show notes. Here's our conversation, which took place over the summer of 2023. All right. Dale Allison, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So we've connected around your book, which we're going to spend some time talking about. The book is called Encountering Mystery: Religious Experiences in a Secular Age. But before we do that, let's just kind of orient listeners to who you are and what you do and your background a little bit. Give us the short bio, if you will.
Short bio is that I was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. I grew up in a liberal to middle of the road Presbyterian church. I then had an overwhelming mystical experience of some sort when I was 16. And I wanted to talk about it and figure it out. And the only people who wanted to talk about it in my time and place were evangelicals. So I hooked up with some evangelicals, went to an evangelical church for a year or two, but then went off to college. And I soon discovered that my religious world was a small world. I discovered the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers and became exceedingly confused. And I suppose I really have spent the rest of my life trying to figure out what from my past I can affirm and what from my past needs to be modified or jettisoned, and so on. I majored in philosophy. I also majored in religion. Don't know why I chose the path of religion, but I finally did. And I ended up getting a master's and a PhD at Duke in biblical studies. And I suppose I'm best known as a biblical scholar, primarily, I guess, for my writings on the Gospel of Matthew and the historical Jesus. My own self-conception is that I approach early Christian texts through the eyes of Judaism. I'm also boy, I don't like the word expert, but I teach classes and also write books on Second Temple Judaism. So that's my way of thinking about Jesus and the early Christians, is through the Jewish comparative texts and environment and so on. So that's basically, I guess, who I am.
Right. And right now you teach at Princeton Theological Seminary?
Yes, I'm at Princeton Theological Seminary. I've been here for a decade. Before that, I taught for 15 years at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. So they're both Presbyterian mainline institutions.
Yeah, I think your beginning story of having an experience early on and then looking for who might want to actually talk about this and ending up, at least in Christian world, in evangelical circles, that similar to mine, background to early childhood, teenage mystical experiences and trying to find places for it. It seemed to me I grew up in Southern California, the only people that were interested were in the vineyard movement.
Yeah.
So yeah, that wonderful merger of charismatic American charismatic Christianity and the Quakers, which is just a really fascinating collision as I witnessed it there for a little while.
Yeah. The problem for me is that I was only in the evangelical churches for maybe two years or so. That is, my questions became so difficult and I became so confused that last part of college, most of graduate school, I quit going to church. I just couldn't figure anything out.
Yeah. My stint was brief as well, and I think we're all trying to figure it out. And what you've written this book, so you've written a lot, as you just said, on, you've got commentaries on Matthew and Second Temple Judaism, but here you are later in your career, and I think I read a review someplace where you finally decided, I've got the courage to write about what I really want to write about, or something like that.
Yeah.
Encountering Mystery. What's the book about? Give us an overview.
So first of all, it's about a number of experiences. So human life and religious life are full of an infinite number of things. So what I've done here is I've simply taken certain religious experiences or groups of experiences. For example, I look at experiences around deathbeds. I look at this popular literature on angels, trying to figure out whether you could make anything of it. I look at what people report they do when they are praying, especially when they are interceding for others. I look at reports of mystical encounters or experiences where people say they were overwhelmed by some transcendent love. I also look at experiences in which people say that they have encountered something evil, some horrific, malign force that wants to destroy them. I also look at, have a chapter on near-death experiences. So what I'm doing in this book, I think, is three things. Those are the things I'm talking about, but I'm doing three things with them. First of all, I'm just reporting. I'm saying we now know a lot about these things. We really do. This is not an unsortable mess. And I'm just reporting and telling you what we now know about these experiences. Secondly, I'm trying to destigmatize them because there are still many places in our culture where if you have one of these experiences, you keep it to yourself because you are afraid of censorship. And the third thing, and this is not the main part of the book, is that at a couple of points, I sort of push back against reductive materialism. So I'm not a materialist. I think that materialism is or should be passé, and that there are certain things in this book that make you think twice about an easy, off-the-cuff reduction of these experiences to things that we understand about the physical world. So those are the three things that I'm trying to do there.
Yeah, just briefly, tell us materialism. What is that? So for folks that may not be familiar with that term.
Okay, well, so what I mean by materialism is really what I grew up with, especially in high school and college. So my professors tried to explain everything about the world in terms of forces and elements and materials that they they knew. So I was taught that ultimately everything comes down to physics. Everything about you and me is chemicals and electricity, and there really is nothing beyond that. Another way of thinking about this is everything is genes and environment, and genes are physical, and your environment is physical, and that's who you are. And all human beings are simply um, products of that. I remember a philosophy class, my first year in college, and running into a textbook which argued for physical determinism. That is, there's no free will at all because we're simply in a physical system and all forces are determined, and everything's been determined since the beginning of this show, long, long, long ago. Uh, and I didn't like it then, right? But I think more than not like it, I think there are reasons to reject it and to think that this is false and that this is too small a view of the world. Anyway, I'm not being philosophical here, trying to come up with a definition. I'm simply talking about the sort of easy dismissal of religious experience and mystical things that I ran into in my own education.
Yeah, and there is, I think, a great deal of suspicion. I find the more formal education a person has, the more suspicious they are of mystery.
Yeah, well, that's true, and that's one of the things that also characterizes me because I'm a multiple personality. I've imbibed all this skepticism, and if you read this book, I'd like to think that it's fairly careful and it's even measured, and I'm always looking at what the other side might have to think. Um, Actually, I was interviewed on a podcast last week by an atheist who read the book and liked it very much. Now, he's not a typical atheist because he has some space for mystery and mystical experiences, but he read it and he felt that we were sympathetic. So I always have this skeptic I carry around me. It's part of who I am. I can't get rid of it, right?
Right,
So
right,
you
right.
just have to be honest, and you're always going back and forth in your own mind, arguing this. You're arguing against yourself. And actually, when I write a book, I never start out thinking, oh, I'm going to write a book because I know what to think about X. What I'm usually doing is saying, I have no idea what I really think about X, and I'm not going to know unless I write a book. So that's
Yep.
how I think.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of a process of discovery. Um, Now, I'm curious. This is a book that is unusual for a seminary professor to write, and also just my experience in seminary circles. While there is, I don't know what the right word would be, but, well, yes, there will be people in congregations that you serve that might have these experiences, but that's about as far as it goes. You've you've given a lot of permission in this book for people to read all of it or parts of it and say, "Yeah, I've had something like that." What's this like as a seminary professor exploring this topic?
Well, look, I have to be honest. I'm not a courageous person, and I only wrote this. I'm in my late 60s, right? So I can see retirement and so on. Um, uh, Most of this book, to be honest, incorporates thoughts and discusses subjects that I've been interested in since I was a teenager, right? And I've had some people comment on how many books I've read or how many books I suppose and articles I supposedly read for this. I didn't read much at all because I'd read all that stuff anyway, right? It's just part of who I am. Um, the thing is that I have no courage because I didn't do this when I was in my 40s or 50s, right? I'm doing this now after I have tenure. I'm doing this after I have already made my reputation or whatever you want to call it in the field, right? So I'm taken seriously for my historical work. Nobody's going to fire me for this. My salary's not going to be cut. So it's easy for me to be honest now, but that's how I would characterize this. I would say I've always been fascinated by these topics, always thought there was something to them. And writing this book was fun because I finally got to be honest, I suppose, honest with myself and with the world. One of the things that people never ask is why did you get into this field in the first place? You're a historian of Jesus, early Christianity, all this stuff. But the truth is, it's because I had this mystical experience, and it was so overwhelming and so powerful that the rest of my life has been lived out of it. It's what made me so passionate about understanding religious texts, right? So it doesn't begin with academic interest. It actually begins with something personal and existential and really profound. And then it morphs somehow into how do you make a living with this, right? You got to make a living with this. Got to be a pastor or teach religion, got to write books, that sort of thing. So it's just that I had the freedom to do this and finally said, what the heck? I don't care anymore what anyone thinks.
Right. Do you find that as you either have published the book or talked about these topics that people will now come to you saying, well, I've never told anybody, but, and then they'll tell you.
Yeah. So that's everywhere. And even though I just wrote this book, I have lectured on these subjects often to seminary students and occasionally to church crowds. And that is always what happens. In fact, I'm surprised if I talk about some of these things and it doesn't happen. And usually a student in a class will wait till everyone else goes and then come up. The student is alone in the room with me and then say, okay, this happened to me. I was at my cousin's bedside and I saw this. And of course, nobody believes it, but I think it happened. So I've gotten, I don't know, tons of stories. Once people knew they had permission from me to speak what happened to them. That is, they had the sense, I'm not going to be censored. He's actually going to take me seriously. Once they have that thought, then they're really happy to divulge something. And it really is a motif in the literature, and it's a motif in my experience. People will come up and they will say, this happened to me. I've never told anyone, or I've only told my wife, or I've only told my husband, or I only told my best friend. That kind of thing, it's a record. It just repeats over and over and over again. So the people who don't get these stories are the people who haven't communicated that they're open to listening to them somehow, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I don't know how that works. This is actually kind of occasionally gets spooky and mystical here, because once in a while somebody will come up to me and after 2 or 3 minutes they'll share something and I'll think, how the heck did they know I wasn't going to laugh at them? But they pick up a vibe or something I said. I don't know what it is, but yeah, the world is full of these people who will tell you their story once they are comfortable with you.
Yep. And I've found the same thing in when I go to congregations, and from time to time I will kind of go down this path of describing something that happened to me or something that happened to somebody else, and then afterwards, there's somebody hanging around in the greeting line afterwards, and they're waiting till everybody is gone, and then they'll say, "So I've never told anybody, but," and then they'll tell you that story. It makes me wonder, has everybody had some experience? But we're so conditioned to not talk about it, because in previous times, this was the topic of conversation. I mean, you go back, before 1800, 1900, this was a much more common part of the conversation, I would think.
Yeah, my favorite illustration of this is actually in the book, and it has to do with some social psychologists who were interested in learning about grieving experiences or bereavement experiences. And they went to a nursing home and they asked the people there if they had ever, heard a dead spouse say something, or ever felt the presence of a dead loved one, or ever seen, the dead husband or dead wife. And they found one person, I think it was 1 out of 50 that they interviewed. One person out of 50 said, yes, I've had encounters with my dead husband. And they went back and they thought, you know what? The anecdotal evidence says that we must be doing something wrong. We know that there was more than one person in 50 that has this. So they went back and they did it again. And this time they went in and they prefaced their questions with a big, long introductory essay saying, this is fairly common. It doesn't mean you're mentally ill. It's a normal part of the grieving process. After they did that, it went from 1 person out of 50 to 25 out of 50. That's just astounding, isn't it? It's unbelievable. Yes. And it tells you how the world works, that people think they're going to be censored. And so they don't share things. So it went from 5% to 50%.
Yeah. Once you lay the groundwork, people are quite open to.
Yeah.
And if they find they have a receptive audience and somebody that doesn't think they're going to be considered whatever crazy or nuts or something like that.
Yeah. That's the key to it.
Yeah.
And again, that's part of my purpose in writing this book, was to destigmatize this, because you will still often hear people talking about these subjects and they'll have the suspicion that somebody is mentally ill or somebody was on drugs, that sort of thing. And it's all nonsense. It's utter nonsense.
And now one of the things that you, in your section on prayer, I'm going to read a quote that from page 83. This is not just religiously oriented people that we're talking about. So what you say, one reason multitudes, including individuals unaffiliated with any religious tradition, continue to pray is quite simply that it is hard for them not to. I thought that was a great sentence. Praying seems almost instinctive. It feels like something we might learn to do, even if never guided in the matter. Some form of prayer it scarcely surprises appears in all times and places.
Yeah. So I think it must have a biological root. It really must. Unfortunately, the data that I've been able to gather on this is contradictory. That is, we've got lots of surveys about prayer, but very few of them put together prayer and atheists. But whenever they have, the numbers have been really surprising to me. I saw one survey which said it's hard to find an atheist who says he doesn't pray at least once in a while, right? I have read that. I've also seen statistics that say, atheists, about a third of them will pray once a month, that kind of thing. But I don't have any solid statistics here, just a number of surveys which have indicated that this is not a rare experience for people. So for atheists. So there must be something built into us. This is just natural. And by the way, this is one of the things that comforts me, because, there are lots of paradoxes associated with intercessory prayer and a lot of things that make no sense at all. But I'm sort of comforted by the thought that God made us, and we do this instinctively, so there must be something right about it. That's how one of my ways of rationalizing praying for others, which is really a difficult thing to get your mind around when you think about all the philosophical issues that are involved in that.
Right, yeah. I also think that, and to some degree, we're all atheists now, in terms of our worldview. I mean, we're so cultured from what, for lack of a better word, and you using the subtitle, this, a secular worldview, where the sacred is, is not in the everyday parlance, but yet something is obviously there. I mean, most atheists that I run into when I have a conversation with them at any length, it's not that they don't believe in something, it's that they don't believe in kind of a traditional male figured God that, is controlling actions in the world. That's kind of oftentimes what they're talking about, which, well, I don't believe in that God either, is the end of that conversation.
Yeah, I do sometimes talk to people and they'll tell me they don't believe in God. And then when we sit down and I try to outline my apophatic theology, they'll say something like, well, maybe I believe something like that, right? So you're right. Often atheism is just, I don't believe in an anthropomorphic figure sitting on a throne somewhere in outer space, right? But to go back to your larger point, I had a public school education, kindergarten through college. And I think I was taught, no, I know I was taught how to think about everything without reference to God or without reference to a transcendent reality. There was no transcendence or God in my history, my psychology, my science. It wasn't anywhere. So I was actually taught how to think about everything without God. And so, being the religious person I am, I've had to, I don't know, unlearn some of those habits or wonder whether they're correct or not. I don't want to belittle everything I've learned. I had a wonderful education, and I obviously value the mind. I've spent my whole life as a intellectual or academic, whatever you want to call it. But I was trained to think without God. And my first habit is, maybe that's what you meant in part. We're all atheists. Yeah, I think like an atheist all the time. It's just what we do.
Yeah, it's just it is the world that we swim in, and
Yeah.
yet what we're talking about is that even though that is the world that we swim in, people are saying, but there's something I don't understand. There's something mystery. I love the fact that you called the book Encountering Mystery, because I think that kind of sums it up. I will confess to you, the one chapter I was the most suspicious of, and this reveals my own bias, was the chapter on angels. Um,
Yeah.
because, so often my experience when I was in a parish in particular for 25 years is that when people talked about angels, it had a lot of connotations of those little cute little white babies that had wings
Yeah.
kind of in Hallmark cards.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you expanded my understanding of angels from that particular chapter. Say a little bit about that chapter and what
Well,
are angels for
so first of all, I had a good time writing that chapter, um, because I spent a lot of time reading these popular books on angels. And it's one of the things that, as theologians or seminary instructors, we don't like to think about. But people aren't reading Reinhold Niebuhr or Jürgen Moltmann, or the people we study here at seminary. Nobody in the pew reads these folks. They don't read Karl Barth. But they do read books on angels. Several of these have been best-selling books. And there's a huge market, especially since the early 1990s, this huge market for angel books. So I thought, okay, I'm going to read a bunch of these and decide, is there anything going on? Now, I do think that's the most critical chapter in the book. And I do say that I'm unconvinced by a lot. I also think we're really careless as a society or religious society with this category of angel, because we throw everything into it. That is, some people, when they hear a voice warning them about something, will say, oh, that was my angel. Or when they fall off a roof and they don't get hurt, they'll say, oh, that was my angel. Or they'll see a luminous anthropomorphic figure in their room and they'll say, that was an angel. All sorts of things get plugged into this category of angels. So one of the things I had to do was separate them, put them into categories, do a sort of form critical analysis of these, and then ask if in any of these types of stories there's anything that's very interesting here or that might make one puzzle. And I said, yeah, there are a few things if they happened as people relate. Okay. But I also uh, I'd like to point out that I actually end that chapter by doing something I'm sure nobody has done before, but it occurred to me at some point that these books aren't just sort of polemic against a secular worldview, right? They're saying there is a God, there's something more, we are loved. These books also, at least many of them, are full of moral instruction.
Mm.
Excuse me. They're full of moral instruction. And they, in effect, say here's what angels do. We should go and do likewise. That's a really interesting thing that's going on in lots of these books. And two of them are just, that I remember off the top of my head, are just clear about this. They actually end with that. They'll say something like, well, angelic intervention is fairly rare, right? But we're always here and we can always help people. And angels are helping. We've seen how they help. Let's go and help other people too. So I don't think these books are empty. I actually am sympathetic to the extent that they're cries for transcendence, or there are people saying there actually is more to the world than your education tells you. And they're also communicating that we should be like angels, which means we should love our neighbor and try to rescue other people and so on. So I actually found the reading of these books, despite my skeptical stance, I found them more edifying than not, even when they were, simplistic or credulous or naive to my point of view.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I need to pick up a couple myself because I kind of entered into it that way. But what it does speak to, which I think, which is what you're saying, is that people's hunger for the transcendent, and this is a way they are experiencing and articulating it. Clearly, that's just so deep in people in this modern postmodern secular age.
Well, it also shows up in a different way, but I think it's related in our entertainment industry, because there are so many shows on the paranormal or, whatever.
Vampires or whatever,
The common theme is we don't understand it, right? It's a mystery, whether it's Bigfoot, UFOs, near-death experiences, these all, from one point of view, I think they should all be separated and examined carefully. But from one point of view, they're all saying, my teachers don't know everything, right? There is more out there, and the world is mysterious. And I'm sympathetic with it. I actually think the world is mysterious and really strange, and that we don't understand it.
Yeah. So you have church connections. I have church connections. It strikes me that church is not, at least North American mainline Protestantism, is not particularly enthusiastic.
No.
My experience is when I open this conversation, I have conversations with lay people in congregations who say, I've never told anybody. And at some point I will say, you've never even told the pastor? Oh, no, I could never do that, is often the response. Yet this is, to be rather crass, this is the business we're in. Have we completely so rationalized Christianity, at least Protestant Christianity in North America, mainline version of it, that we've kind of locked this out?
So here, I think it's helpful to call upon history. So you need to think about how Protestantism began. Protestantism began by looking at Roman Catholicism and saying, well, we'll keep this, but we're going to get rid of that. That's really what it is. It's a subtraction. All right. Now, Roman Catholicism was full of late medieval Roman Catholicism was full of miracle stories. I mean, it was full of bleeding statues and appearances of Mary and the host, becoming real blood and so on. And Protestants had to discredit all of this. They had to discredit all of these stories. And so what happens very early on, you can already see it in John Calvin, is this idea maybe the miracles were only required when we were producing the Bible. It had to, accredit Jesus and the apostles and the prophets and so on. But once we have the Bible, we don't need any more miracles. So you get what's known as cessationism, which is the view that the miracles ceased at the year 100 or when the Bible first appeared, that sort of thing. And that means that the early Protestants, the mainline reformers anyway, the Lutherans and especially the Calvinists, they are really skeptical about anything that's a miracle if it's not in the Bible. And so they actually generate the rationalistic criticisms of religious experience that you still see today. Now, they will sometimes say, well, it must have been the devil who did that. And we don't do that today if we're rationalists. But we know about hallucination. We know about rumor. We know about deliberate lying. So the Protestants come up with the standard rejections for miracle claims. And if you know anything about our history, when the Methodists show up, they are enthusiasts. And it's a cuss word. It's bad because they're doing some different sorts of things, right? And that is part of our tradition. And then what happens to mainstream people like me is I belong to a tradition which, especially in 19th century German theology, wedded that cessationist tradition with the skepticism of the Enlightenment. So we actually have two big drivers here. We have a religious skepticism, and we have historical, an Enlightenment secular skepticism. And my Presbyterian churches are downstream from that, right? Yep. And if you look at, famous people I grew up with, like Paul Tillich or Rudolf Bultmann, they just say straight out the day of that anyone could believe in a miracle in the Bible or out of the Bible. That's just long gone. Serious people can't take this stuff seriously. So why does Bultmann demythologize? Well, because he doesn't have a supernatural worldview anymore, right? So he kind of reduces it all to what's going inside the person, going on inside the person, existentialism and so on. Because in the outside world, it's all just what the secular scientists say it is. There's nothing else going on. So there's a really strong tradition here, and it's both secular and religious.
Yeah, and so that just makes its way down in through the ages to local ministry, parish ministry in today's world.
It does, but there's also a more practical thing here, and you can be a postmodern cynic of power here, because often when people have religious experiences, they interpret them as revelatory, and sometimes they interpret them to imply things that the people in charge don't believe, right? So the Methodists or the Pentecostals, they end up with some doctrines or ideas that the people, the mainliners don't like. And that's another reason to dismiss these people or be suspicious of them. I've got an example in the book from the life of Cotton Mather, where he's talking to a woman. He thinks she's had a genuine revelation. But when she says, I think I should be the pastor, then he totally discredits everything she had, said and done and so on. Originally, he was convinced there's something really interesting here, but after it crossed the line of his own authority, nope, that's got to go.
Interesting. So job security is a factor, and it could be a factor.
Look, that's true for everybody, right?
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so just kind of as we start to move to wrap up, what's your hope for this book, and who's it for in particular, I guess? Who did you have in mind? I mean, obviously from what you said earlier, you wrote this for yourself. That was kind of, or out of your own experience, but like, who do you envision reading this and it being helpful for?
Actually, I envisage, or maybe I would say hope, that's better, hope that everybody except academics read this book. So it's not for academics. I frequently write books that are just for eggheads, right? And you have to know Hebrew and Greek and so on to read them. So this isn't like that. This is a popular book written on a popular level. It's not a contribution to the academic study of religious experience, right? It's also published by Erdman's, and it's also clear from the very beginning that I'm some sort of Christian. So the audience is broadly Christian. But as I said before, I think I've had two atheists interview me about this book, and both of them were friendly. So I'd like to think that it's written in the sort of style that it would invite anyone to come in and think about these things. It's certainly not exclusivist. There are points at which I stop and say, well, this sort of experience is consistent with a Christian worldview, but a Sufi can, have this experience and interpret it in, Sufi terms, and Buddhists can have this sort of experience and interpret it in different terms. So I'm always, trying to be open-minded. Again, that's partly because that's who I am inside, and I can't put everything together. So I'm rambling here, but I think this is a book for everybody except somebody looking for an academic contribution.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. It does seem at the end of the book, just one more question here that I wrote a note. You seem to want to tackle the crowd that's suspicious of religious experience. I noticed you got to the end of the book and it was like, okay, for all of you who I've kind of outlined these different categories, we've got angels, we've got prayer, we've got near-death experiences, and so forth and so on. Here's my kind of my understanding of what this is. You seem to really try to anticipate some resistance there in the end. Was that your intent? And where were you going with that?
So I envisaged some pushback from people in the cessationist tradition. And then I anticipated some pushback from people who want the Bible to be sort of the sole authority, and it can't function with anything else. It just has to be by itself. And they're worried that an appeal to religious experience is going to mess up how theology is done. I also, and this has been confirmed by what happened after these two people read the book, I have two good friends that are Bardians. They have very different worldviews than I do. And of all the people that I've talked to, they're the most cynical about the book, right? And they just don't understand appealing to experience for anything, right? That's just not how they're used to doing theology. And so we're friends, and they like me and they wish me well, but they're really suspicious of this book, and they think it must have some ulterior plan here, that deep down it's sort of a subversion of the way that they're doing theology. I don't think this book is doing systematic theology, and it's not making any suggestions as to how to do systematic theology. But I did anticipate these sorts of readers and friends when I was writing. So I read a review just last week that was very positive about the book, but he said the one chapter which is sort of theological, has a polemical sense that the rest of the book didn't. And I think that's because at one point I engaged with some comments N.T. Wright made, and I disagreed with them. And looking back, I could have done that without quoting Tom. I just could have said, some people think like this. I don't know why I did it. Probably because I read the book and his book and was just thinking about him at the time when I was writing this.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I just thought that was just intriguing that I got to the end and I thought you were anticipating largely from your academic community, and I think I found it a helpful way to engage with people who also, as I talk with folks, have they're not opposed. They just have lots of questions, and it's like a new language for some folks, that we're now saying experience is valid, and that's uncomfortable for some folks.
Well, for me, it's just acknowledging what's going on in the world. It's just being honest. Yeah. These things do happen, and people are interpreting them. And therefore, we should be interested, especially if we're theologians or pastors. If we're ignoring this side of life, our congregants are doing it anyway, right? Whether we're helping them or not, right? So turning a blind eye, wishing it would go away or whatever, doesn't make any sense to me. It's just true. It's just the way the world is.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks much. Great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this.